Vernon. Yeah, you can clap. Yes, let's go. Unbelievable. This is really exciting night. We've got a great program, ladies and gentlemen, and I do want to introduce myself, though we are online as well, people around the world. I'm Doug Bradburn, the president and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon, and I'm delighted you're here with us. This evening book talk is sponsored by the Ford Motor Company, who's been sponsoring Mount Vernon, if you can believe it, since Henry Ford visited here and fell in love with the place. And of course, he was a great fan of George Washington. He grew up in a house with a portrait of George Washington on the wall. That's something we need to do more of in our country right now. More portraits of George Washington on the wall. But at any rate, he came here. He fell in love with the smoke jack in the kitchen, which is a Washington invention in which when the smoke goes up the chimney in the kitchen, it turns a turbine which spins the spit, and always looking for those little innovations. And in fact, Henry Ford loved it so much, he asked for the design of it, and the director at the time sent it off to them, and he installed it in his little colonial village where he was building there. So the Ford Company has been a great friend of Mount Vernon for many, many years. We're in the Ford Orientation Center here, and we're delighted that they sponsored this incredible book series. And tonight we've really got a great program for you. But I also want to mention some upcoming things. This week is really quite special. On Thursday night this week, we're going to have an evening with Gordon Wood. Gordon Wood is a good friend, has a great new book called Power and Liberty about the Constitution of the United States. And we'll have a wonderful conversation that evening as well. And then a lunch and fellowship on December 1st with Charles Clark and his new book, George Washington Parke Custis, A Rarefied Life in America's First Family. George Washington Parke Custis is, of course, the grandson of Martha Washington, grew up here at Washington. He built Arlington House. Really was the first monument to George Washington. He acquired a lot of the original portraiture and a lot of the original furniture at Mount Vernon and would put it on display out at Arlington House. In fact, he would put out a big George Washington's marquee tent that he used during the American Revolutionary War, which should be here at Mount Vernon, but which is now available to be seen at the American Revolution Museum in Philadelphia, where they have an extraordinary exhibit there on it. So look forward to that. And another book talk coming next month, former research fellow Sandra Moats on her new book, Navigating Neutrality, Early American Governance in a Turbulent Atlantic. So let's get to the main event tonight. Dr. Andrew Roberts is the Roger and Martha Mertz Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's also a visiting professor at the War Studies Department at King's College London, the Lehrman Institute Distinguished Lecturer at the New York Historical Society. He is a great writer of our age. He's written or edited 19 books, ladies and gentlemen, which have been translated into 23 languages. That's 22 more languages than books I've written. I've written in one language, and no one has read it, so that's even better. And he appears regularly on radio and television around the world. We're here with a star. We're in the room with a celebrity star tonight, and we're going to have a great time. His books include the best-selling The Storm of War, A New History of the Second World War, Masters and Commanders, How Four Titans Won the War in the West, Waterloo, Napoleon's Last Gamble, and Waterloo, A Life, which was the winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Award for biography and a finalist for the Plutarch Award. His 2018 biography of Sir Winston Churchill, Churchill Walking with Destiny, became a Sunday Times and New York Times bestseller, was translated into 9 languages, and won the ICS Churchill Award for Literacy and the Council on Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Prize. It's an extraordinary study of Churchill. I'm a fan myself and have read all the biographies I can, and I really enjoyed that book. He's won many other prizes, including Wolfson History Prize, the British Army Military Book of the Year, et cetera, et cetera. The accolades are here, but why talk when we can get to the real deal, the real thing? You will judge if he lives up to all these awards tonight. This is going to be a tremendous opportunity. I want you, Stephen will go around with cards he's going to hand out. I'd love to hear some questions from the audience. And of course, we have a lovely audience online who can ask questions, which will be handed down to me as well. Let's all give Andrew Roberts a big Mount Vernon welcome for the last king of America, the misunderstood reign of George III, as it's called in Great Britain, which I have a picture of that, actually. So there's a picture of the book cover in England, which is what I just read out. It's called George III, The Life and Reign of Britain's Most Misunderstood Monarch, which seems scholarly and important. And you know what they said? They said, well, for an American audience, we got to tart it up a little bit. And so they give us the Kardashian version of George III, very colorful, the last king of America. It makes it all about America, which is tremendous. That's why we love it, and that's why we love him. Andrew Roberts, come on, join me up here. Let's give him a big round of applause. Wow, they got our number. Look at this. This is a much more handsome book, Andrew.
Yes, and also they, for some reason, have used thicker paper, which makes it look incredibly long. I promise you, ladies and gentlemen, it isn't that long. About a third of it is the paraphernalia at the back. So, so don't let that put you off, whatever you do.
There are beautiful pictures as well, and some people always judge their presents by the weight. I always do. You know, you wrap it up and put it under the tree. You're like, this is a serious present.
Well, just don't drop it on your toe.
Absolutely. But congratulations, Andrew. It really is a phenomenal study. I believe it's the first cradle-to-grave biography of George III since the 1970s. Is that correct?
Yes, for some reason, for half a century, there hasn't been a cradle-to-the-grave life, which is extraordinary considering how much new information has come out over the last 50 years, and particularly, of course, since Her Majesty the Queen put 200,000 pages of the Georgian Papers, this extraordinary program at King's College London and the Royal Archives online.
Yeah, the Georgian Papers program is a phenomenal thing, and I do want you to tell the audience a little bit of what it's like to do research in the Round Tower there at Windsor. You may not know, George Washington's Mount Vernon is a partner with Windsor, with King's College. We actually send fellows over to work in this incredible manuscript collection that they are digitizing now. Tell us a little bit more about what it's like and what's there.
Well, it's the most exciting thing imaginable, as you can imagine, working in the on the very top floor of the Round Tower at Windsor Castle. The major problem is not looking out of the window, because you can see 3 counties from this tremendous part of the castle, and they've got everything. They are good-natured and charming and helpful and intelligent people, of course, who push you towards particular parts of the archives that aren't often used. But also you're allowed complete access to everything in the Georgian Papers. And as I say, 200,000 pages of it. And I didn't know that you were involved as well. That's fantastic. Well done. That's brilliant. Because
well, you know, our good friend Flora was one of our fellows there, as well as Bruce Ragsdale was working on George III's agriculture.
Of course they were, exactly. Actually, I hope we're going to get onto the agriculture, because Farmer George, of course, it's a tremendously important aspect of him. He wrote articles in agricultural papers about crop rotation and manure and things like that. Certainly the first and last king of England to write about manure in a magazine.
Charles.
No, absolutely. Actually, yes, you're quite right. He probably will be the next person who writes about manure on a regular basis.
Well, we will get to that. We have our own Farmer George here as well, so it is one of the things that unites their story, including the great unpleasantness as well, which we'll get to. But let's start with George III and the Hanoverians. Let's give us the 101 on this dynasty. Who's George I? Who's George II? Who is this man, George III?
Well, George III is the grandson of George II, who is the son of George I. And they have, the Hanoverian dynasty is only on the throne because of the great and glorious revolution of 1688. And it's very important to remember that they are, in a sense, a family who are solely there because they're Protestant, and solely there because the Stuart absolutists were got rid of in the 1688 revolution. And so they are not people who believe in the divine right of kings. They are people who believe in a limited and constitutional monarchy.
And so how was George III raised? What was his family life like? I mean,
Well, for the
What
first
was that like to be raised as the future king?
well, for the first 12 years, it was incredibly happy. It was he was raised in an enlightened and charming and good-natured, happy family. And then his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, died when he was 12 years old, and the sort of darkness descended because his grandfather, George II, who hated. This is the part of the dysfunctional side of the Hanoverian family, where they tended to load their own children.
Yeah. Pause on that for a second, because it was not only his grandfather that hated his father, but his grandfather's, his mother, his grandmother hated. I mean, the things she would say, that this son of theirs was like the devil, that he was the worst thing ever.
That's right. And
how is that possible? What happened?
Well, the grandmother was thrilled when her own son died.
Yeah.
That's how screwed up this family was, until you get to George III, who loved his father, and the lowest point, I thought, came when George II, George III's grandfather, refused to have his son Frederick, Prince of Wales, buried, and so George III had to actually sleep in the bedroom below the decomposing corpse of his father, which is obviously going to have a severe psychological effect on you one way or another. And it was, and in so many ways, he therefore was the person who was not, I mean, he loved his father, he tried to love his son. Unfortunately, Prinny, I'm sure we come on to the Prince Regent, but he was in the 3 years that
his son's nickname was Prinny.
Prinny, yeah, as in Prince.
Yeah.
And Prinny, in the 3 years that I was researching and writing this book, which I noticed you haven't put up like that. There we are.
Available after the talk.
In all of those 3 years, I was totally unable to find any redeeming features whatsoever about the person who later became George IV. He was a massive spendthrift. At one point, he built up debts equivalent to the amount that the British nation was spending on the Royal Navy.
Oh, my Lord.
Yeah, he had compulsive buying disorder. He was the sort of 18th century equivalent of Imelda Marcos when it came to clothes.
Well, we'll get on to that for sure. So one of the things, what about his education? One of the things I know you benefited from at the Georgian Papers is that a lot of the educational papers are there of the young George III. What was his education like compared to, say, a normal aristocrat of, at the highest levels?
It was far, far better than a normal aristocrat because the aristocracy went to Eton School, which didn't teach you anything much particularly and was constantly in a state of complete riot. Whereas George III, who has very often, and very recently in fact, been made out to be extremely stupid and ignorant. It's completely wrong. By the age of 8, he was able to write Latin and Greek. He was he spoke 4 languages. He had a tutor in the Earl of Bute who got him to write these essays, which really are very first class, and some of them are groundbreaking. The ones that the Queen has allowed to. I mean, she's allowed everything to go online, and there's one in particular which I use as an illustration in this book, actually, where he completely destroys the arguments in favor of slavery. He's commenting on Montesquieu's essays on the laws, and he takes each of the arguments for slavery that were being made at the time and completely excoriates them all. And this is quite something because, he's somebody who never bought or sold a slave in his life, never invested in any of the companies that did that, and of course ultimately signed the legislation that abolished the slave trade.
He has a reputation as a bit of a moralizer throughout his life, right?
He was highly, you're quite right, he was very self-righteous.
Well, he's king.
He's
Yeah.
king. If you
Yeah.
can't be self-righteous if you're king, you know, I know it's like not
He's the head of the church.
pontificating if you're pope. You know, of course you. Of
Exactly.
course,
Or the head of Mount
you know,
Vernon.
it's part of the job,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah. No, I'm glad you appreciate that. He's all, but no, exactly. There are drawbacks. This is in no sense a hagiography. You know, I mean, there are drawbacks to his personality, and self-righteousness is one of them.
So he has this. His father dies young, as you mentioned. There's another thing in common with our George here as well. But he has this mentor, the Earl of Bute, Bute,
Bute.
and Bute is loathed. Who was he? Why did George like him so much? I mean, at one point he says, "You're the only friend I can have in government." What is Bute's particular power over him?
The power over him was that he was his tutor, and he was also his sort of father figure. He was a surrogate father to all intents and purposes, because of course his father died when George was 12. The drawback with him, there were two drawbacks. The first is that the world believed, everybody believed wrongly, that that the Earl of Bute was sleeping with his mother, Princess Augusta, and that was a political disaster, especially when he came to the throne, when George III came to the throne in 1760 and appointed Bute to be his prime minister. And so all hell broke loose.
Yeah.
But the real reason that people hated him in an age which was so prejudiced was that he was Scottish. And the Scots, of course, had come down to Derby during the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 and threatened London. And so they were tremendously unpopular in Britain in the 1760s. And to appoint a Scot to be prime minister was an incredibly controversial thing to have done.
Yeah, because the Stuarts were Scottish, and of course the Jacobites who supported the Stuarts were Scottish.
And to make it even worse, the third Earl of Bute, was a Stuart.
Yeah,
he was on the distaff line of the Kings of Scotland.
Yeah, so lots of things going against him. We'll talk about that. What does the world look like when a George ascends the throne?
Well, it's a world war, of course. We're fighting what you call the French and Indian Wars, when we call the 7 Years' War, and it's going pretty well by 1760. You've had the great year of victories, the Annus Mirabilis of 1759, and so things are going pretty well. And he's popular also because he's the first king who is British, and he says to Parliament, born and bred in this country, born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain. And that's very unusual, because there hadn't been a king for 150 years who had been born and educated in Britain.
That's extraordinary. I mean, so when we think about King George II, he would have had a German accent when he spoke English, and when he appeared.
And George I didn't even speak English. So, but whereas George III didn't have any accent, and actually he didn't think much of Hanover, the electorate from which his family came.
So he comes in the midst of a war, and I want to do a little one-on-one on how the British constitutional system worked. Well, really the political system and constitutional system. So he comes in, and you said he appoints Bute as his as prime minister.
Yeah.
But we don't use the term prime minister in the 18th century that often, if at all.
No,
he's the Lord Treasurer or something like this. Do you have party elections where they choose, and what party's going to lead? What is the role of the king relative to the government? Walk us through.
You have general elections, but not in internal party elections. There are no parties, essentially. There's this agglomeration of aristocratic oligarchs called the Whigs, who essentially dominate politics and have dominated politics since the 1688 revolution. And so for 80 years, these people, a vast sort of cousinage of people have been in control. And George III doesn't like that. He wants to be able to choose people from across the political spectrum. He is sort of non-partisan in this sense. He wants to be able to choose Tories. He wants to be able to choose independents. Occasionally, as we've mentioned, he wants to choose Scots. And of course, the Whigs hate that. And so, in a sense, you can see the entire reign of George II, which is the longest reign of anyone, of any king of England, nearly 60 years, in terms of his attempt to break the oligarchy of the Whigs.
Mm. Well, he has that belief in a Patriot King, that Lord Bolingbroke's idea, this kind of country idea of a king that stands above party and rules in the common good.
Exactly, and he gets that from his father, who was a friend of Bolingbroke. And Bolingbroke wrote in 1744 this book, the Idea of the Patriot King. And this is something that is a sort of driving influence, especially, I think, because his father died so young.
Yeah.
He therefore idolized his father and very much idolized the political beliefs that his father had.
It's a very popular track and belief in North America as well, with the ideologies that are being developed about what's wrong with Britain, this idea of Bolingbroke, but they have more of the kind of real Whig Trenchard and Gordon stuff as well, melding in with that in North America.
And also, of course, the other thing is that the founding fathers saw themselves as inheriting the mantle of the 1688 revolution,
Yeah.
and to another extent, the 1642 revolution against Charles I.
Yeah.
And so what that does, totally understandably, of course, is to make them need to present George III as a Stuart absolutist. Whereas he certainly wasn't. I mean, he didn't believe in the divine right of kings. He believed in a limited monarchy, and he certainly didn't. I mean, he revered the British Constitution, largely, of course, because the Glorious Revolution gave him, as king, enormous powers.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to that. Let's talk about. I have a little thing here that George III. He never learned. This is a quote from you. He never learned that once a prime minister's heart was no longer in the job, he should be allowed to let him leave as soon as possible.
That's right, and I wrote that specifically with regard to Lord North,
Yeah.
who, although he was tremendously popular in the House of Commons, and he was a jolly, good-natured sort of person who suffered fools gladly and was a very good domestic prime minister. As soon as the American War broke out, it was very clear he was in no sense a war leader.
Yeah.
So he tried on some 20 occasions to resign, and the king wouldn't let him because he didn't see anybody who was more likely to bring the House of Commons along with him.
How do you form a coalition government in this period? I mean, why couldn't the king from the start just get somebody he wanted and have them rule? Because you don't have parties, so what do you have?
Well, you don't have actual parties, but as I say, the Whigs, the sense of the Whigs are there, and you do have cousinage. You do have people who are friends, who are relations, who are political allies in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords.
But like when you say like one of these people has an interest of like 80 people that will follow them, or 15 people that are, how are these interests secured?
Well, in a House of Commons of 650 people, to be in charge of a group of 80 is quite something.
Yeah.
And that certainly gets you the right to be a cabinet minister and the right to be consulted in the affairs of state. The way that you keep your faction together is essentially to dole out honours.
Right.
That's what everyone's obsessed with throughout the 18th century and indeed the 19th century. Some might argue the 20th and the 21st century as well, in fact. If you're in a position whereby you can bump up a baron to a viscount to an earl to a marquis, and so on, then you have great political power and influence.
Yeah.
And so you essentially barter your position in the House of Commons and your support in that way.
And it's commonly understood that people in offices will make money in these offices. They'll get a stipend or a sinecure from some official title, but then also they might have a role where the money's running through their own accounts,
and also, of course, you're going to get a job for your younger brother and your cousin and your sort of great step nephew-in-law, and if you can't do that, and if it's clear that because of the sort of spigot of the royal honours, ultimately royal because the king has to approve all of them, is switched off, then you can very, very quickly lose your support in Parliament.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, fascinating, and the way you describe it is extraordinary because George III is, on the one hand, he's got these wonderful naive ideals about what you should be as a patriot king, and then you have the reality
Mm.
of sort of the, the how the sausage is made,
Yeah.
and that balance, which, and that becomes a really challenging fight for him because he doesn't want his honor is always at stake, right?
That's right.
He keeps coming back to his honor because he can't
Yeah.
break his promise to this guy or that guy, but he doesn't like people and.
Um, well, I mean, that's right. He's caught, as you say, between the. I mean, I don't think all of his ideals were naive. I think the idea of trying to be able to reach across the aisle and choose the best people to be in the government isn't a naive idea.
Broad bottom,
The
cool,
broad bottom administration, as it was called, was actually a rather fine concept. But again and again, he came up against the sheer numbers, the issue of numbers in the House of Commons.
Well, let's get to the main event here at Mount Vernon, which is the coming of the American Revolution. What happened? Everything was great. At the end of the 7 Years' War, there were victories. There was a massive empire created. People were toasting the king everywhere from Bangor, Maine, all the way down to whatever, somewhere far south, Savannah, Georgia. And then 10 years later, everybody was thinking he was a tyrant.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'll tell you exactly what happened. What happened was that we won too big in the French and Indian Wars. If only the French had been allowed to have some kind of a threat in the North American continent, then it might not have happened. But as it was, the victory was so complete that the nearest French troops were in Haiti, 1,000 miles away. And so the American colonists, totally understandably, with a 2.5 million population, a burgeoning economy that was growing at 7% a year, year on year, as many bookshops in Philadelphia as there were anywhere in the empire apart from London, and no, as I say, external threat, wanted to become self-governing, wanted to become self-ruling, and rightly so. And there was, I think, actually at that point, nothing that the British could have done about it. We were 3,000 miles away. We didn't have a war economy, let alone a total war economy that you'd have needed to have prevented this. And so ultimately, the America was at the right historical sense and moment for its development.
And the king's, or the idea of the king, plays a critical role in this. I mean, my goodness, the questions are rolling in. I'm still talking to this man, unbelievable. So the Americans for a long time are regularly celebrating the king, and it's the parliament and the ministers that they're angry at. But of course, at some point, they make that switch where the king has to become the villain.
Precisely, and he certainly has to become the villain because by the time that he is attacked, of course, in the Declaration of Independence in the July of 1776, the war has already been going on for 14 months, and so in order to clothe themselves with the mantle of 1688, you have to prove that the king is a tyrant, as the Declaration states, and unfit to be the ruler of a free people, and so on. But the only drawback is that it comes up against the experience, the actual lived experience of the American colonists up until that point, where they are, to all intents and purposes, one of the freest societies in the world, certainly one of the lowest taxed, certainly the lowest regulated. And so,
yes, this rankles you. I get that from this book.
Well, no,
deluded Americans.
No, there's nothing deluded about it. Of course not. It's you are right to take your independence, to grab your opportunity to do this. But the idea that therefore the person that you're taking your opportunity against is a tyrant is wrong, because there are any number of late 18th century tyrants.
Give us some examples
of
what real tyranny looks like.
Okay, what real tyranny looks like in the 18th century is Catherine the Great, who in Russia kills 50,000 people in the Pugachev uprising, what the Spanish are doing in Louisiana, where they kill all of the leaders of the New Orleans uprising, the French in Corsica, the Prussians with regard and Austrians regard to Polish independence. You know, there is no shortage of tyranny, of genuine tyranny. And then you have King George III, who doesn't arrest an editor, doesn't close a newspaper, doesn't impose troops in any city apart from Boston in 1768, who allows the Stamp Act Congress and the First Continental Congress to meet. You know, the idea that he is a tyrant in the 18th century concept of the term is ludicrous.
Well, and in fact, I think one of the really wonderful things you do in here is you show that the Americans are asking the king really to expand his prerogative powers, really to reject the idea of crown and parliament controlling all of the empire and say, well, look, parliament can be sovereign in the British Isles, maybe just in England, whereas the assembly in Virginia or in New York or wherever should be sovereign with the crown there. So they're asking the crown basically to take on more.
And imagine if he had.
And they're jilted lovers.
That's one way of putting it. But imagine if he had, because then he would genuinely have been a tyrant. If he hadn't listened to Parliament, the Cabinet, the majority of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, that's the definition of a tyrant.
Interesting. Well, before I get to these, because this is an incredible book, as you see, it's very long as well.
As I tried to point out, if you take away the notes, the bibliography, the index,
there's a lot of pictures.
all of the wonderful illustrations, thanks for mentioning that as well, Doug, you will realize actually it's a relatively short book.
I want to get into more of the history itself, but I do think, talk a little bit about George III's madness. Now, this is something obviously that we know in popular culture from many sources. I mean, the madness of King George, the play and the movie.
Yeah.
But talk a little bit about that scholarship, which is really been changing recently, and you've been involved in that.
Yes.
Let's hear the real story here.
Thank you. Yes, it's a very weird story actually. It's all in the appendix of my book, where
This small book with an appendix.
This tiny little book with a 4-page appendix. Yes. What happened, very strangely, in the late 1960s, a mother and son medical team presented a series of extremely, not false, but misleading symptoms of the king's illness. I'm very pleased that we're discussing this before supper, owing to the fact that a lot of it is to do with the color of the king's feces and urine. And
they were blue.
They weren't.
They weren't,
the thing.
though. That's the thing.
On occasion they were blue, but on far fewer occasions than this mother and son made out. And so the doctors, having been given these symptoms, wound up thinking that it had to be this physiological disease, porphyria. What it in fact was, and now pretty much since 2010, all of the expert medical opinion. This is the first book to state this, but it's the theories have been going around in medical journals for over 10 years now. Is that he had bipolar disease, the disorder, the type 1 affective aspect of that terrible disease, and one of the manic depression,
but an extreme case,
very extreme. In one prodrome attack of 1765, and then attacks in 1788, 1801, 1804, and then the final one that carries on for 10 years from 1811. And so, actually, it's the full. You know, he frothed at the mouth. He spoke ceaselessly for 24 hours. He became physically violent, and so on, to the point that he had to be physically restrained. But in a sense, the wonderful thing now is that we no longer have this terrible stigma attached to mental illness.
Right.
You know, we've thankfully finally destigmatized this, so it is not his fault. The Whig historians for 200 years blamed George III for being. It was a sort of moral failing of his that he went mad. We can
or it's seen as a sign of his sort of being a tyrant. And,
precisely, yes,
yeah.
exactly. We can get rid of all of that rubbish because it's it's completely sort of wrong and unfair. So you have instead a tragic story of somebody who had a wonderful marriage to a woman he met 6 hours before he married her. Can you imagine? Who they then had 15 children. They had lots of interests in common. He fell in love after his marriage, and they were very happily married for 44 years. And then, because of this terrible illness, it broke up and they separated. And there's a lot of tragedy in this book as well.
I want to read this letter from Gouverneur Morris to George Washington, which you mentioned in your book. And it's about this disease and the impact of the king's disease and madness, of course, had major political ramifications, and of course, is seriously important in many ways. And Gouverneur Morris is writing to George Washington. This is from Paris in February 1789. And Washington then, is going to become the president of the United States. He'll be inaugurated in April of 1789. And Gouverneur Morris he's a minister in Paris. He's ultimately going to be in England. And he writes about the kind of gossip. By the by, he writes, in the melancholy situation to which the poor King of England has been reduced, there were, I am told, in relation to you, some whimsical circumstances. His first outset was to seize Mr. Pitt by the collar, and with outrageous language addressed to the rebel general, had nearly strangled him before he could get help. And he says, afterward, the defender of the faith, in one of his capriccios, conceived himself to be no less a personage than George Washington at the head of the American army. This shows that you have done something or other which sticks most terribly in his stomach.
Well, understandably so. But equally, I don't think you can hold somebody to account for something that they say or do during a
of course,
attack.
but I think
but that happened only a couple of years ago. There was somebody who brought out a book with a title of something that he'd exclaimed when he was mad. You just can't do that. And so it strikes me that, and also, of course, he didn't have any attacks between 1765 and 1788, by which time, America had been an independent country for 5 years. So it did not affect the American Revolution.
I have a question from the audience here, and we'll begin going through some of these, and we'll get to some of the other wonderful themes and stories in the book. Did George III ever get over losing the American colonies?
Yes, very much. He got over it incredibly quickly in 1785.
Andrew doesn't regret it either. My goodness.
No, don't worry, because I know that had we stayed as one country, you'd have been dominating mine very quickly. In June 1785, John Adams came to be
lovely
to be ambassador, and when he did, George III said, actually, I've got the exact sentence. Do you mind if I read it?
Please. Please do. We both had to go to the glasses.
I brought it along.
We've gone blind in the service of our country.
I will be very frank with you. This is the king said this to Adams. I was the last to consent to the separation. But the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I've always said, and I say now, that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the US as an independent power. And of course, then 15 years later, he called George Washington the greatest character of the age. And so I think the answer to that is yes, he definitely got over the defeat. And the defeat was, the loss of America was the greatest strategic catastrophe to overcome my country between the loss of the Angevin lands in the 15th century and the fall of France in 1940.
Could you speak to King George's role as a father to his many children?
Yes. Well, we mentioned the totally ghastly eldest son, Prinny, who he didn't have a good relationship with at all, not least because of Prinny's spending, and he had to bail out Prinny, and every time that a mistress of Prinny charged £5,000 for the love letters to be returned, it wound up being the king who had to pay up.
I mean,
and so-
this is I mean, there were mistresses all over the place in the 18th century, but
Yeah.
George III seemed to be the only one who didn't have one.
he was literally
And
the,
like his brothers all had them, and they married people they shouldn't have married.
and his
kids all
uncles
had
and
'em,
his kids, and one
unbelievable.
of his sons had 10 illegitimate children.
Why was he
Um,
so straight-laced?
Because he loved his wife.
Yeah.
He was uxorious. He was the only one of the Hanoverian kings who was faithful to his wife because he loved her. It's a quite a moving love story, actually, this one.
Well, and she obviously, we talk about what was her relationship with the children.
Well,
I mean, obviously she had many of them.
She had 15 of them
15
exactly.
over 21 years.
Yes. So she was pregnant or having children, for the majority of the first 20 years of their marriage. She had a very good relationship with all of them, again, apart from Prinny, who was a beast to her. But the problem was there were several problems. One was the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which meant that you could not get married unless you had the king's permission.
But that was the king's law. George III made that law.
No, absolutely, and I'm very critical of him for having made that law.
I got to that part in the book.
In this book,
because his brothers had been marrying all kinds of random people. Right?
Very random indeed. Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, there was one. There was one who. The family seemed to be quite sort of grand and aristocratic, but in fact they were tremendous spendthrifts. And the sister of the person who married the king's brother was also a gambler, and she ran out of all her money. She then had to marry a hairdresser in order to pay off her debts. Or at least not be responsible for her debts, because if you got married, you weren't responsible for your debts any longer. So she married this hairdresser. It was a disaster, and she wound up ultimately being handcuffed to a wheelbarrow in Augsburg, where she had to sort of clean up the street mess as a sort of lady of the streets, handcuffed to a wheelbarrow. And this was the king's sister-in-law. So he was the sister of the sister-in-law. So you absolutely had to do something about this if you were going to keep the dignity of the crown. And what they did was to pass this act. And of course, instead of meaning that everybody actually had lovely and good-natured happy marriages, what it meant was that all of the king's children could just take mistresses and say, well, I would love to marry you, darling, but unfortunately I can't. Owing to the fact there's an act of parliament preventing me from doing this.
Wow, I'm going to try that one. That's good. Okay. But yes, there's quite a bit of humor in this book. The 18th century is an incredible age of wit and witticism, particularly in political scurrility. Do you have an anecdote you want to share? Because I know it's not coming from George III. But
George III unfortunately had what one would call an Hanoverian sense of humour. There's that old Mel Brooks line, what's the opposite of comedy? Germany. But luckily, thank God, in writing a book, because you don't want to. My last book was about Winston Churchill, where there was a joke pretty much every other page. They were Winston Churchill's hilarious gags, but the king made 2 jokes, neither of which were funny. But luckily, it was the great age, the golden age of wit.
Samuel Johnson,
exactly. Anyway, so my favorite joke, which I know lots of people know anyway, but I'm going to tell it anyway because it's my favorite joke of the late 18th century, was when the radical journalist John Wilkes was being attacked by the First Lord of the Admiralty, the Earl of Sandwich, and Lord Sandwich said that he was either going to die of the pox or on the gallows. And Wilkes replied, well, that depends, your lordship, on whether or not I embrace your lordship's principles or your mistress.
Speaking of mistresses, excellent. Okay, let me dig in here. This is a little bit of random grabbing here. Speak a little bit more about the personal religious faith of George III, and how did that feature into his kingship?
It featured a great deal. He was a he was a true believing Anglican Christian. He went to church a good deal. He preferred to talk to bishops than to politicians. And his Christian faith was something that underlined pretty much everything that he did.
Mm. And so, who then was George III's favorite prime minister?
William Pitt the Younger.
We'll talk a little about him. Who's
Yes,
he?
yes, William Pitt the Younger. Well, you see, he had these favourites who he appointed as prime minister, and they were always disastrous.
Right.
Bute, we've mentioned, of course, Lord North, the most disastrous by far of them, was somebody he'd grown up with and had become a childhood friend of. And he realised, luckily, about halfway through his reign, that this wasn't working, and that what he actually needed was somebody who was utterly brilliant, and that turned out to be the son of William Pitt the Elder, who had been an earlier prime minister of his, but had not turned out well.
Yeah, you have a great line in the book actually where you said that George III needed William Pitt the Elder, and he ended up getting the Earl of Chatham.
Yes, it was the same
It
person.
was the same person. You know, the Brits always changing their names when they get promoted. But Chatham, poor Chatham.
Yes. Well, he had
Pitt had been the great hero in the 7 Years' War.
He'd been
the great dominator.
He'd been essentially
Pittsburgh. Americans loved him.
The Churchill of the 7 Years' War. But unfortunately, he then contracted gout, the most terrible disease, by the way. And if anybody in the audience has any gout pills on them, I, for some reason, didn't bring enough from London. It would be very nice if I could just borrow a couple. And nowadays, you can deal with it with Arcoxia or allopurinol. In those days, unfortunately, it sent you mad. They had no way of dealing with it, except for obviously not drinking red wine and port, which none of them seemed to take into account.
It was often prescribed.
Right? It was often prescribed, yes. Dr.
Meat,
Addington actually said, whatever you do, don't take exercise, eat a lot of red meat, and definitely have lots of red wine. Precisely the worst three things that you could possibly do. Anyway, it sent poor Pitt the Elder mad. For the last 2 years of his premiership, he never saw the king at all. He hardly ever went into Parliament, and he had food put through a hole that he made in the bottom of his door of his house, so that he didn't need to see anybody because he was in such a mentally collapsed state. And this, this was 1766 to 68, key moments, obviously, in the course of the American Revolution. But his son was a genius. His son was, in a sense, of the 14 prime ministers that George III appointed, Pitt the Younger was by far and away the greatest.
How did George III survive the French Revolution? Furor?
Well, it was incredibly lucky because he only got over his second bout of madness in April 1789, 4 months before the revolution broke out.
Right.
So had he still been mad, Prinny would have become the Prince Regent, and Charles James Fox, who welcomed the French Revolution and thought it was a very good thing, and said sort of the equivalent of bliss was it in the dawn to be alive. He said that he actually said that it was the greatest thing that had happened in the history of the world. He'd have been prime minister, whilst the guillotines were starting to start up. So we were very fortunate that he got over, that the king got over his madness in the nick of time and kept Pitt the Younger as prime minister.
Well, so there's all kinds of wonderful characters in here, and here's a question from the audience who's clearly read the book. Thank you.
Why do you say that with such surprise in your voice?
Well, because it just came out. It's brand new. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Fair enough.
They're overachievers here at Mount Vernon. That's what we do. Your book does a great job improving the reputation of George III. Congratulations. This is one of these comments and a question. But
I like the comments so far.
Yeah, but it portrays Horace Walpole in a poor light. Poor Horace Walpole. Can you talk more in context of Walpole's writings and his impact on contemporary views? Walpole is a common source for historians to go to understand what's actually happening.
And I loved it.
Who is he, and why don't you like him?
Oh, right. Horace Walpole, Whig MP, son of the Prime Minister Sir Robert Walpole, witty, charming, incredibly bitchy and malicious. So historians absolutely love quoting from his diaries and correspondence.
He's always in the room, though, right?
He's always in the room.
Yeah.
He's in the room where it happened.
Did people know that he's writing this diary at all? They don't have any idea.
Yeah, no, they must have guessed. And he also wrote to a wide range of correspondence, also with these fabulously witty and incisive remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, he made it all up.
Oh,
Yes, he should not be used as a serious historical source. He was a fantastically, as I say, bitchy and malicious gossip who just invented stuff.
Was George III responsible for prolonging the American Revolution by 3 years? And the quote here from George III, June 79, if others will not be active, I must drive.
Well, I mean, he kept the.
It's in 79, because North is trying to retire by this point.
He was, no, exactly. But what also happened at that stage was, of course, the French got involved in the war, and it's very important that when one thinks of French foreign policy, the French are always there when they need you. And he's a key. It's a key moment in when in February 1779 the French come in. They turn it, therefore, and especially when the Spanish come in 1780 and the Dutch in 1780. Well,
the Dutch.
The Dutch. You have this this agglomeration, therefore, of navies that, when together, far outnumber the Royal Navy, and so it turns from being a colonial war into a global war, a war that needs to be fought in Gibraltar and in India, in Africa, in the Channel. In 1779, there's a really serious danger of invasion of the British homeland, which George III is very good, by the way, at creating the morale necessary to turn that back. But it's a world war where the American War of Independence essentially gets shunted off into a sideline for as far as Britain is concerned, where we make no actual movement until capturing Charleston in 1780.
Did the British have an opportunity to win the war?
I don't think so. No, I mean, I think perhaps right at the beginning, right at the very beginning, had Bunker Hill been a victory, had Washington been captured.
Bunker Hill was a victory.
Not really, was it? It was a Pyrrhic victory at the best times.
Yeah.
I mean, we lost many more troops than you did.
And you won Bunker Hill, which is
well,
a great piece of property.
Thank you.
Yeah. Breeds Hill, actually.
Yes, exactly. But not once you carry those the artillery from Ticonderoga across those hundreds of miles.
But you could have beaten Washington at Brooklyn.
This is the thing. If he hadn't had the sheer leadership qualities, this is the thing about George Washington.
He knows where he's at. This is good.
No, not at all. No, it's in the book, for God's sake. The sublime leadership of being able to look up Valley Forge. It starts with a V.
V for victory.
The sublime leadership of George Washington, and also, of course, the Fabian tactics of when William Howe comes across at Kip's Bay, to be able to retreat back to Trenton and that New Jersey campaign each time. The ultimate idea, the Germain Plan, as it's called, where Sir William Howe was going to come up from New York from the south, try to take the Hudson Valley at the same time as Sir John Burgoyne was coming down from Canada to get to Albany. And if they had met and somehow managed to thereby, through the Hudson Valley, split off the the New England colonies from the rest of the colonies, that was the one hope, really, strategic hope that they had.
Right.
And then Howe screws it up, essentially, by going off east to capture Philadelphia. And that's what brings the French in and so on. So I don't think that I think that once you get to Valley Forge and through his leadership, he keeps that army together, then I think it's impossible for the British to have won.
Yeah, once the French come in, it becomes a very challenging issue, unless you're just going to abandon the rest of the world.
Well,
North America,
yes, which wasn't going to happen. I mean, the West Indies at the time were contributing far more financially than the 13 colonies, and you couldn't let that go. And when Admiral de Grasse goes there, and then of course comes back in one of the great decisions of the period, you know, to return there, and then the Royal Navy is unable to establish dominance in Chesapeake Bay. The war's over, frankly, and so long before Yorktown, in a sense.
Well, so let's end on a big note. One of the great things you bring out here, I think, is King George III as an incredible patron of the arts. He's an Enlightenment prince. He really creates a lot of things that we associate with the modern British monarchy, both symbolically but also culturally, I think.
Yes, he's of course accused by Thomas Paine of being the royal brute of Britain. And this is a man, ladies and gentlemen, who created the Royal Academy, whose library of 80,000 books creates the kernel of the British Library, who the planet Uranus was originally named after because of his interest in astronomy and also his contribution to Herschel's most gigantic, the biggest telescope in the world.
It was Georgianus, or what was
Georgianus, the star Georgianus in Latin. He also was he invited Mozart, of course, to play at Buckingham Palace. Haydn, he tried to bring over. Handel said that whilst that boy is alive, my music needs no other champion. He was somebody who supported, of course, and patronized the great Georgian architects of the neoclassical tradition, men like Robert Adams and William Chambers and Wyatt and so on. So you have this figure who, and of course, also he bought over half of the paintings in the Royal Collection, which today is the largest art collection in the world, private art collection in the world. So you have this person who is a tremendously cultured figure. And as you mentioned also, the creator of the modern monarchy in many ways.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well,
a lot of people associate that with the 19th century.
That's right, with Queen Victoria, exactly. But I think that in fact it goes back to Queen Victoria's grandfather, because what George III did was to, by Buckingham Palace, of course, he bought the Gold State coach, which is still used 250 years
sounds
later.
like a terrible ride. You don't want to.
Terrible, no, because it goes like this. The Queen, everybody has complained about it, but they still use it. Of course, you know, partly because
I hear that crown is heavy too. They still wear that.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, it's only one day. Just put up with it, you know. But he invented the royal walkabout, the trooping of the colour, the royal enclosure at Ascot, so many of the sort of aspects of the monarchy. But the key thing is that also, and you see this when you see Her Majesty the Queen today, that sense of frugality in eating and drinking, prudence in finance, and hard work and a commitment to lifelong duty. Those are things that George III gave his so
that ideal of a Patriot King sort of lives on in the ideal of what the monarchy should be as in a modernizing, more democratic.
And that's certainly something that the Queen got from her father, King George VI, and is in the sort of DNA of the best of the Windsor family, and has been. I mean, George III, of course, was also the first king since Charles I to be buried at Windsor, and since then all of the monarchs have been buried at Windsor. And when the dread day happens, Her Majesty the Queen is going to be buried there too.
At the very beginning of his reign, you get the sense he's very active politically, trying to find the right government, the right ministers, his friends, trying to make it work. What is it like towards the end? I don't mean, you know, obviously he has his madness for the last 10 years of his life, but at the end of his life, has he become less political? Has he become neutered by the reforms? Has he become more this figurehead? how has that worked out?
He steps back, certainly. I mean, obviously, he starts to go blind in 1804, so one steps back anyhow, in a sense. But the real difference is Pitt the Younger. He has somebody he trusts, somebody he knows has got the best interests of the nation at heart, somebody who is incorruptible and a decent figure, as well as being a brilliant orator and so on. And so he very much, this is the moment at which the British Constitution changes. And he no longer appoints each of the individual ministers. They see themselves as being responsible to the Prime Minister, which is obviously something that stays on through to the present day. And also there's a deeper sense, I think, also of him recognizing that the way that things are going to be done in future can't be the same as the way they had been done in the past. He learnt a lot of lessons. Obviously, the Napoleonic Wars, he learnt a great deal of lessons from the defeat in the American War of Independence. And so you have a constantly evolving, sort of intelligent and cultured man who is far removed, it strikes me, from the Lin-Manuel Miranda kind of caricature of King George III.
Well, Lin-Manuel Miranda's King George steals the show, and so do you. It sounds like you've written a book that tells the founding story of two modern nations, ours and the British Constitution as we know it today. So very extraordinary. You have to get this book. If you care about your history, it's here for you. It's filled with wonderful things. It's beautiful, and you'll get a lot out of it. It's very rich. Let's all give him a great round of applause. Andrew Roberts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.